Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About It. I'm your host, Taylor, and before we get started today with our guest, I just want to take a moment to just really honestly, from the bottom of my heart, thank all of you. I didn't foresee myself being in this position of doing this for this long. So for those of you that have, stuck through this since the very beginning, since episode numero uno, mucho gracias. Thank you guys so much. I really would not want to be doing this if it wasn't for your guys' support and for it being helpful. I read your messages as much as I can in your emails, and getting those messages about how the podcast has helped you guys with anxiety, with just remembering you're not alone when you're like crying on your kitchen floors and feeling like so lost, that you guys can listen to this and, kind of get yourself out of that a little bit. It's really, really humbling and super moving. And I think just goes to show the power of talking about things. And I always think it's kind of cheesy how the podcast is named Let's Talk About It, because it comes up so much in conversation of let's talk about that. But there really is so much power when we do talk about these things. And I just want to thank you guys for joining these conversations with me. And I really want you to know that it does not, your support, and each time you guys listen and when you subscribe and when you share with your friends and when you leave a star or a review on iTunes, or you DM me or you email me, that none of those things go unnoticed, and that each of those things really does matter in showing your support for the podcast. So really just wanted to start off today with a little piece of that gratitude. I find that sometimes when I get really stuck, that's something that can help pull me out, is practicing gratitude. And for some reason, it can be so easy to focus on the negative things. And, it's a little difficult for me sometimes podcasting, because I don't get to see any of you guys or really interact or hear your voices or see your faces. And so getting those messages really, really does help a lot. And I just want to take a moment to be thankful and, express that, because it gives me a lot more motivation to move forward with this. So in moving forward with today's episode, I do want to give a little bit of a kind of trigger warning here. We are going to be talking about trauma, and we are going to get pretty deep into that. So, just want to give you guys a heads up on that. And obviously this is a safe space, and, we're going to walk through it. But I'm really excited to chat today. Jen is actually a family friend through Robert, who has been on the podcast before, and I've mentioned him several times throughout the podcast as a father figure for me. And he's put me in touch with Jen, and she's been super amazing. And she's actually an award-winning creative writer, journalist, and performer who writes about science and society with an emphasis on things like race and gender and the politics of mental health. So she's based here in Seattle, and I've spent a little bit of time with her, and she's just been really, really great. So I'm excited to talk more about her story and have her share with you guys. Just want to share a little bit more about her. She was trained in history and science at Harvard and in investigative journalism. She also received her master's in fine arts from Rainier Writing Workshop at Pacific Lutheran University. So she really, really does super amazing essays, and I'll link some of those in the episode notes for you guys to check out. I'll pull a few quotes from those throughout the episode today, but not only does she do this work with creative writing, but she also co-founded in 2015 an organization called Reframe, and she also co-founded the Center for Media Justice, which all kind of helps to advocate for marginalized people that are impacted by the criminal justice system and the immigration system and climate change, and helping those marginalized communities to speak for themselves. So really just all around, she's doing amazing work. You guys can follow her at Jen Soriano Writes. And I'm super excited to get into some of this stuff and, share this vulnerable space with Jen today. So with all of that being said, let's talk about it. All right. So welcome, Jen. Thank you so much for being here and for, taking the opportunity to be vulnerable and share your story with us. There's so many things I want to know and that I'm excited to learn about you and about your story. So thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to kind of start us off with was talking a little bit about your journey to being a creative writer, because that's been a lot of what I've kind of learned about you. And I think we'll share a little bit more about like some of your pieces throughout this episode. But maybe just to get us started, just a little bit about kind of how you got into that.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's this knowledge out there. Some people say that whatever you do as a little kid, like a 3 or 4-year-old, is probably what you should do for the rest of your life. Huh. And I'm kind of seeing that in my son right now, actually. He's all into taking things apart and putting them back together. And I'm like, okay, you're going to invent some major life-saving climate destruction prevention machine or something.
Yes, love it.
When I was his age, I wrote a ton. I mean, once I learned how to write, more like 5. Mm-hmm. And I would just write in these little notebooks, and they were all these little, supposedly fiction stories, but really things that were going on in kindergarten. Mm-hmm. And, stories about, well, this is what happened in the playground to this one girl named Jane. And so there was this urge to write that I had since I was a kid. And then the rest of life happened, and it feels like it was this roundabout way to then get to a place later in my life where I'm actually craving that creative writing again. And for a lot of what I think of as my daytime adult life, I have been working in the social justice field and doing communications work for organizations that work with people directly impacted by all kinds of systems that cause problems, like the immigration system and the criminal justice system, and have been really privileged and fortunate to be able to make a career out of helping people who are otherwise marginalized and silenced be able to tell their own stories and make a difference in the laws that impact their lives. And for a while, I thought of that as a detour away from my creative writing. And now I'm starting to understand that it's all one path and that it all is about being able to express things that don't get to be expressed easily in daily life because of what the BuzzFeed 2-minute read will allow on the internet, and because of social norms of, what's okay to talk about at a dinner party, and because of power structures and, what gets put on cable news and what doesn't. And so now that I'm turning back more to my own creative writing, I'm seeing that it's just part of that same process of now allowing my own voice to be able to express some of the stories that have been hidden about not just myself, but my culture and the history of the Philippines, where my family is from, and my own experiences with mental health, which, is its own area, as you know, of discussion that gets marginalized and stigmatized and suppressed in different ways.
Yeah. And through that, when you say, then life happens, there's been a lot that's happened in your life. Even, before we record and, when we first kind of got in touch and talked about all the different things that you could share on the pod and all the different conversations we could have, I was like, holy shit, there's a lot here. And part of me is that's just life. That's part of what makes our lives so beautiful. But there's really been so much resilience, I think, that you've shown throughout your story and in your writing. And it's amazing to me, all the things that you do, not only with your writing, but with your organizations and helping pass those laws and advocating for those marginalized communities. That is just so incredibly needed. And I'm wondering if we can kind of maybe dig in a little bit to one of those topics that I thought was very much under talked about and isn't one that I don't think I've ever covered it on the podcast before, but one thing that you've written a lot about is about chronic pain, and kind of this, this illness that is very invisible, that people can't necessarily see, that sometimes doesn't really make a lot of sense. And you've tried several different kinds of therapy with that too. So would love if you could share a little bit kind of about that and like what that looks like. So there's still so much about that I don't know.
Absolutely. So there's a piece that I wrote called A Brief History of Her Pain, in which, as I was writing, I figured out, wow, it's actually really true. Something that I just wrote and typed onto my computer, which was to the effect of, pain has been my most serious and longest relationship, essentially.
Yeah, that's wild. Like that is wild to think about that. And again, I think goes to just to point out the resiliency here that, yeah, that's wild.
Yeah. And for a long time, I didn't realize that wasn't a regular condition. Like I just thought that everybody walked around in a constant chronic state of some kind of pain. And I mean, it is true that there's millions of people that are afflicted by chronic pain, that we live with chronic pain every day. And there are people that aren't. And I didn't realize that until a friend of mine, Mari, was telling me while we were sitting around a dinner table, what you're describing about how you feel right now, I never feel like that. You know, I've never experienced that. I wake up in the morning and I feel fine. I'm like, really? So in some ways it took some reflection back from other people about how, there's actually a way to live where pain doesn't dominate your life. Yeah. That started me more on a path of actually writing about it. And another long relationship that I had in my life was a 7-year relationship with a therapist, who was my first therapist that I actually kind of stuck to because my very initial experience with therapy was not good. Yeah. And I write about that in the piece too, where essentially I went to go see a therapist because I realized that I didn't have to be in this much pain as my friends had helped me realize. But then when I went to her, she started to therapize me, I think, based on my race right away. She just out the gates said, oh, well, it makes sense that you'd be here and would need to talk to me because in Asian cultures, it's so taboo to talk about this kind of stuff. And it just was not where I needed to start the conversation. Yeah. Actually, where I needed to start the conversation was really physiological and not her sort of fake anthropological assessment of why I needed to be there based on my skin. And why I needed to be there, and I told her this, was I actually need to be here because I'm having trouble breathing. It's actually kind of straightforward. I'm having trouble breathing because sometimes I'm in so much pain. I feel like I can't fully take a breath. And it ended up being a good thing to go to her because she's the one that referred me to then the second therapist. And that second therapist is somebody who focused on breath. His practice is called Breath, Body, and Being. And with him, I did a process called focusing that is a somatic-based therapy that allows you to realize that your body is actually not dominated by pain, even if you are in pain. Yeah. And it allows you to focus in on parts of your body that feel more at ease and that feel more strong, or whatever the adjective might be that is more generative than pain. And it allows you to be able to draw from those parts of your body to be able to comfort the parts of your body that feel more in pain. And at first, when I was just thinking about it through my cerebral brain, like after the first couple sessions, I was thinking, well, I don't know why this would help, because it's like kind of chopping your body up into these different parts, and aren't I trying to be more whole? But actually in the experience of it, what it allows you to do is it allows you to feel like you have more resourcing in your body than just having a full body experience that is dominated by pain. And that is what I felt a lot of times. Yeah. And what that would look like for me would be basically having a real hard time getting up in the morning, pretty much every morning. Every morning felt like having to throw off this lead blanket with a Mack truck on top of it and get myself out of bed to then kind of muster all this energy that I didn't have, because all of my bodily energy was going towards what felt like suppressing this dam of pain. And by going through the focusing, I could get up in the morning and then tap into a part of my body, even if it was just like my little toe. That was like, oh, actually, that's feeling kind of good. It's feeling kind of warm and fuzzy under the sheets. And, I'm going to just focus in on that. Yeah. And so that was really the beginning of a process of managing my pain in a way that it could become less of this almost like abusive relationship and more of a relationship that just was, almost like how blood family just is, it just is. And you learn how to manage and deal with those cards that you get dealt. Yeah. And hopefully in healthier and healthier ways.
Yeah. To me, it's so foreign, and I honestly cannot even actually imagine feeling that kind of pain in your body for so long. And I imagine that would create a really, like you said, kind of this abusive relationship, but a really difficult relationship that you'd have with your body, especially when it comes to actually being able to experience things like pleasure. And I know that's something you've wrote about a little bit too, about sometimes even just having sex was painful. But then I think you also touched on that the period in your life where you felt the least amount of pain was when you were actually pregnant.
Mm-hmm. The body works in mysterious ways. And I am learning as part of my healing process to be really in awe of it. Yeah. And a lot of the source of that awe is also understanding that the pain that I have been in makes sense. And that a lot of the pain that I go through has its roots in trauma and complex trauma. And that the chronic pain has been one of the outcomes of this chronic adaptive response to trauma. And so, once I started to understand that, I had a little bit less of a beat myself up about it feeling about the pain, because something that happens, I think, that is really common for people in chronic pain is this sort of double arrow kind of wounding, to use Buddhist terminology, around not only number one being in pain, but then number two blaming yourself for the pain and saying like, well, why am I so weak? Or, what am I doing? What about my behaviors are so bad that I'm just causing myself more and more pain? Is it just I have a bad attitude and I can't get over it?
Yeah. Maybe I just need to go for a walk.
Right. Just go for a walk. Look on the bright side. Glass is half full.
Exactly.
And, understanding that it is actually this physiological response to life-threatening or the perception of life-threatening experiences over time helped me be able to be more gentle with my body and thank my body for having a response that was clearly very powerful.
Yeah.
But also understanding that there had to be ways that I could manage it and either trick my body or work with my body into being less dominated by the pain. And actually, sex was not that complicated. It was not actually painful. It was the opposite.
Okay.
It was like a drug because of the dopamine and endorphin release that would happen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so the other way that I think my body is that my body, for whatever reason, and I think it is partly because of the way that the chronic illness manifests in my body, hasn't been able to react well to a lot of the standard coping mechanisms that people use, which is, drug and alcohol use.
Yep.
And believe me, I tried.
Yeah.
But my body has just become so sensitive to those things that drinking alcohol, taking opioids, it helps to a degree, but then the backlash and kind of the backdraft of side effects from those things have been so severe that they just haven't been good coping mechanisms for me. And so I thank my body for basically being like, nope, you're not going down that route of addiction.
Yeah. Well, you really listened to your body in that way. Because I think a lot of people probably experience some similar negative, like uncomfortable side effects to coping in that way, but you just keep doing it.
Well, yeah, my body doesn't just tell me things in, normal inside voice.
Yeah.
It will pretty much scream in my face and basically say, you're not getting up for 3 days. So, in a way that sensitivity, which it's been a blessing and a curse, right? So those messages have been pretty hard to ignore. But so in a way, sex became an addiction a little bit for a while, but it's not the worst of addictions. And then work also became a pretty severe coping mechanism for me. But again, there's good things to that too, because I do feel like in the times where the social justice work really demanded, 12 plus hour days, that was a really actually good way for me to be able to channel that type of coping mechanism into positive things.
Yeah. No, I mean, that does make sense. All right, we're going to take a short break right here because pleasure is always the priority. It's always a vibe. And I'm so excited to have a discount to share with y'all from one of my favorite sex toy stores, Bellesa at bboutique.co. And they are the #1 rated sex toy store on Google. They have literally over 25,000 reviews, which has helped them quickly become one of the leading online sex toy retailers in North America. So if you don't trust my input, which I hope you do, you got 25,000 reviews to go to. And if that's not enough, Cardi B loves Bellesa vibrators. So she literally gifted them as all of her guests for their birthday party. So I mean, if you don't already want one, I don't know what else I can tell you, except maybe the fact that they have a new line that's all about discretion. And it's like one of the #1 things I always get asked when I talk about sex toys, when people are thinking about ordering them. Well, is it going to be discreet? Because while we know there's no shame and a little bit of self-pleasure, sometimes you just want to keep it a little private, okay? So I'm really excited to share with y'all Bellesa's new discreet line. It has taken Instagram by storm, and these little vibes come in these really, really cute clamshell charging cases. They literally just look like compact makeup cases. Like you would have no clue that there's a vibrator in there. And it's honestly very, very smart how they did this. Okay. It charges from the outside of the case. So you don't have to take it out of the case in order to charge it. It's waterproof. They use premium body safe materials. I personally own both the Discreet Air and the Discreet Vibe by Bellesa, and I can confirm like 100 out of 100. And if you want to check out their other toys too, guess what? This handy dandy discount is going to apply to all sex toys at B Boutique. You will get 15% off and free US shipping with the code Taylor15. That's BBOUTIQUE.CO. And you will get 15% off and free US shipping with the code Taylor15. I mean, y'all, come on. Owning the same vibrator as Cardi B is like a major flex. So get your discretion on, get whatever other kind of sex toy you want to get. And don't forget to use the code Taylor15. Share it with your friends. We're having a shot girl summer, but some of us still want to stay inside, and even if you outside, you still can give yourself your own pleasure. So be sure to check it out again at beboutique.co, and you will get 15% off and free US shipping with the code Taylor15. Okay. And thank you so much to Balesa. And now we can get back to the show. I think we haven't also discussed any kind of like actual sex addiction on the pod before. And I want to say, I remember when we spoke, and even in that piece that you brought up earlier, that there was this discussion around a 2-year relationship I think you had, where cheating became involved and there was just like a lot of sex, and really enjoying that part. And I think it actually might have been Rob that had mentioned, you got to get her to like definitely make sure that you talk about sex with her because sex was painful or something. And so I think I've had that in my head of like those two conflicting thoughts, but this makes sense that sex was one of the areas where you were able to really feel pleasure and not be in that state of pain and kind of agony with your body, to where that makes total sense that would become like very addicting and wanting to just seek that out in all ways. Yes.
Yeah. And I remember my therapist that I had seen for 7 years saying that the more that you can touch into the grief and the emotions that are behind the chronic pain, the more that there is going to be space for pleasure and joy. And so I think that before I went through that therapeutic process of focusing, really one of the only things that could give me a sense of pleasure and joy was full on sex. And then as I started to gain more of that spectrum of touching into the hard feelings, then I could get more into just sort of like the daily life pleasures of, like hanging out with a friend and just having a really good cup of coffee, right? Like there's pleasure and joy in that. Yeah. But before that therapeutic process, there was just such a dulling of everything in that middle of the spectrum, and everything just kind of on the daily basis. I think because really the thing that would win out in terms of the sensation game was the pain. But the more that the emotional underbelly of that pain was paid attention to, the more it was really amazing. The more that there was just so much more like access to things in daily life fulfilling that same role. Yeah.
I'm curious for you, like, I think for people in general, it's difficult to open ourselves up and like be vulnerable with our bodies with another person. Like, was that a really difficult thing for you to be able to be vulnerable with? Like not knowing, I don't totally know timeline here of when that would have started, but how did you first even come to the conclusion that like, oh, sex actually isn't going to be something that hurts. This is going to be something that feels really good. Was that like hard for you to let those walls down to even allow yourself to be in that place?
It wasn't. And I think that it has something to do with attachment, because I have learned through the many years of therapy that I've done, and also through the reading and research that I'm doing around trauma and attachment and in healing from complex trauma, that attachment to a primary caregiver, right, when you're young is like one of the main determinants of health in all these different realms, right, mental and physical health down the line. And I had a disrupted attachment to put it nicely. And I think for me, in terms of how I related to people, I had this fear and kind of larger social anxiety of being in like groups of people, but I would gravitate towards these really intense relationships with people one-on-one. Yeah. And so as part of that, I think the the physicality came kind of naturally out of that. And also, this is something that's hard to describe and hard for people who don't experience chronic illness to understand, or can be hard. But the chronic pain that I felt, it didn't mean that I was physically disabled to the point of not being able to do a lot of physical things. Mm-hmm. And actually, sometimes physical movement helped me move through the pain, but sometimes not. Sometimes it made the pain worse. And that's part of what can be so hard about it. It's unpredictable. Mm-hmm. But I was actually a really sporty teenager. And, did gymnastics and soccer and all of these things until my body kind of started to give out. Mm-hmm. But physicality is very much part of who I am. And I'm used to being really physical and sporty. And so, sex was all part of that.
Yeah. Well, and just to kind of piggyback on what you just said about the movement and, sometimes that being really helpful, but other times that not being helpful, I think that goes with a lot of things that are self-care, like sometimes therapy is something that like afterwards we feel really good about and we're like, that was really good. That really helped me through this. And sometimes we might go to a therapist that like we don't feel super connected to and feel like, well, that really didn't help me. And that put me in a even more difficult place now. Like now I have other things that are stressing me out.
Right.
Sometimes the things that we do to take care of ourselves work and sometimes they don't, but that doesn't necessarily invalidate, the pain that you feel. And I'm wondering, I think that's an amazing point about the attachment and why that pain perhaps was either easier to move through or wasn't necessarily present at the time. But you've talked a lot about this trauma and how that's related to the chronic pain. Could you touch on that a little bit more?
Sure. So I suspected for a long time that my chronic pain had roots in trauma.
Yeah.
Even before I did more research on trauma and PTSD and post-traumatic growth and healing and all of that. 'Cause people always ask, right? If you have chronic pain or chronic illness, people always ask and want to know, well, what is it from? Mm-hmm. And that's totally natural. I wanted to know what it's from too, but it doesn't have an easy answer.
Yeah.
And when people ask that, I've shorthanded usually to saying, oh, it's just back pain. And then of course, that's always a mistake because then people are just like, oh, okay, I brought you some Advil.
Yeah.
Or bend your knees when you lift things, like things like that.
Yeah.
But really, whenever I'm giving somebody a shorthand explanation of it, there had been this voice in my head that's like, well, really what it is trauma. Mm-hmm. And I haven't felt like that's okay to say. Mm-hmm. It feels like, oh, it's a 4-letter word or, it's going to scare people away.
Yeah.
Like, oh, like you have the cooties. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's been really interesting to me, just that my own reaction to it, because I know from research and also personal experience that a lot of people experience trauma. I think that I know that there's a statistic out there that up to 75% of people in this country will experience trauma, whether that's a specific traumatic event or ongoing traumatic events.
Yeah.
So that's 3 out of 4 of us. So it's pretty common that, any given crowd that you're in or traffic jam you're in, there's going to be 3 out of 4 people who have also experienced trauma. So if that's the case, then why is it so hard to talk about? And for me, I am realizing that part of the reason why is because people don't necessarily want to get into the details of the traumatic events, which I think is absolutely understandable. Mm-hmm. And we don't necessarily want to have this society where all we're doing all the time is talking about like the details of trauma. Mm-hmm. There's this whole phrase about trauma porn and about how like people can get too much into feasting off of other people's victimization. And that's definitely not the direction that we want to go in, I would say. Mm-hmm. But also for me, there was a big part of me that's like, well, why can't I just say that this is trauma related chronic pain and illness. Like, why can't I just say that? Even saying that right now, I'm like, oh, I just said it. That feels uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But it is true. And I know that it's true. And, the research that I've been doing about the biological effects of trauma has been really liberating for me because it has helped me understand even more that my chronic pain, the chronic illness that I experience, is not my fault.
Yeah.
That it is purely a biological reaction to life-threatening or, very deeply affecting events that actually make sense. And so, for me, without getting into the details, I have long known through my first therapist that having this not the greatest attachment to my caregivers as a child really set the course for a lot of chronic stress response in my body.
Yeah.
Just not having that basic nurturing and regulation and kind of biofeedback from adults as a child of, what is safe and what's not has ended up making my body feel like it's unsafe all the time. And then having that chronic stress response has just produced this whole cascade of physiological problems in my body and also, mood stuff. And so that together with what I'm now learning from a structural person that I go to called the Bone Whisperer, who is amazing.
Oh, Bone Whisperer.
Bone Whisperer.
I like it.
Yeah. And he lives up to his name. I gotta say, he whispers to your bones and he heals them. And he thinks that I probably had pretty significant birth trauma. So that, and then all of that layered on top of historical trauma, which is what a lot of the research for this book that I'm writing is about. Both my parents are from the Philippines, and the Philippines was colonized by the Spaniards for almost 400 years and by Americans for 50 years. And the Japanese came in there during World War II and tried to take over as well.
Yeah.
So there's a history of centuries of colonization that essentially is a system of constant threat to your safety and well-being.
Oh my gosh, it goes so deep.
And it does. The roots of trauma can go very deep for a lot of people. And, trauma also comes from single events like earthquakes and hurricanes and the death of a loved one. But often those specific traumas are layered on top of other traumas that have really deep roots. And so, when this affects so many people, because, you don't have to come from the Philippines to have a history of historical trauma. There's many communities that face similar terrible histories. And there's actually a lot of amazing research that comes out of the work of people working with Holocaust survivors and the generations below the Holocaust survivors, but also Native American communities and African American communities. And to me, understanding the roots of trauma behind any particular mental health challenges or chronic illness challenges is just a really important part of the picture. It's not everybody's picture, but if it applies to you, then it can just be extremely helpful in understanding everything that you're up against and then being easier on yourself about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really amazing to me as you go through all of those layers because there's so much to unpack. And it's really interesting that you bring up the possibility of having that birth trauma, like a traumatic birth. One of my favorite podcasts that I love listening to is called Relationship Alive. And there was an episode recently that I listened to that was talking about attachment. And I had never really thought about birth being a traumatic experience for the child. And this episode talked about that. And I remember I actually went over to Rob's right afterwards. And they have a son, Calais, who is a little over a year old now. And I remember I went over and I was like, yeah, like, how was his birth? Like, was that like I can't imagine, for kids that come out and, have the umbilical cord wrapped around, or when they have to do a C-section, or any of this kind of stuff, that it really is this like traumatic experience for a child to even just be born and to be brought into the world. And then, especially, if you add on another layer of that, of growing up in a, around a family that's had this, kind of issues with attachment, or the historical context of the culture behind that, it's a lot of feeling unsafe that your body would start to react to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be. It can be. Exactly. And it's why, in another one of my lives, maybe sooner rather than later, I would love to do more birth justice work, because having my own son in a fantastic situation. I had an amazing birth, and it has everything to do with having had the best supportive system. It was a midwife center at a hospital, and they just were so supportive and incredible and amazing. And they followed my birth plan, which said a lot about my past history of trauma and how I was worried that was going to affect the labor process and the birthing process. And they were so attentive to it that they made sure that we had a really supportive, nurturing birth. And I think that, we won't know until later how my son experienced it, but in what we could see, it just went so smoothly and so well. That birth center is now closed because they were apparently spending too much money per patient.
Oh no. Oh gosh.
Yeah. So it just goes to show that, universal healthcare is really key. But yeah, the way that we come into this world, it sets us up, I think, for...
Definitely. Have you been able to have any kind of like conversations with either of your parents about what that birth looked like for you? Like, do you know any information on that?
I do. I know some information. But here's the other thing. I feel so grateful to have born into this generation, because we know in this country and with some class privilege, because, we know so much more now about what birthing people and babies need to be able to have a good birth. And when my mom gave birth in the 70s, it was pretty much still the era of, pop them out. C-sections are best. And she had already had a C-section with my older brother. And so in that era, you had to have another C-section if you had one before. And I think she was pretty much knocked out. And so, and then my dad worked really long hours. And so he wasn't at my birth because he was working. And so basically, as far as I know from my mom, I was born into a situation where, doctors took me out of her body. And then she wasn't able to really even be awake to hold me. And, in this day and age, it's like we know more now. And I wish that this could be applied universally to everybody, that it's that first skin to skin contact. Well, first skin to skin contact is really key. And this is obviously not actually new knowledge. It's probably old.
Yeah. It
old
also
ancient
kind of
knowledge that
feels like common
recovered.
sense. It feels like that makes sense,
Totally.
Like, of course that would be good.
Right. And it's really important for the baby. And so that probably did not happen for me. And then my mom also said something really mysterious the other day around how the doctors wouldn't let them see me later. I don't know what that meant, because she doesn't remember that well. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
So but overall it sounded like probably less than ideal circumstances.
Totally. And that would make a lot of sense for, that trauma around attachment, and perhaps even wanting to seek that. And I don't know, in my head, I'm just connecting that to those like intense relationships, the one-on-one intense relationships of like having a craving for that almost.
Yeah.
Dang.
Yeah. Well, and I think that so much of what we're talking about has been what has been the driver for me to come back to creative writing. So you had asked about that in the beginning, and there's just so much of this this processing that I've been doing around my own pain and trying to make sense of it that has needed to come out somehow. And writing has been the most, I'd say, deep way that I've been able to do that, because I'm also a musician, but I feel like that brings out other things and satisfies other needs.
Yeah.
But in terms of the really being able to dig into all of these layers around chronic pain and the relationship between pain and trauma and mental health and healing, writing has been the most important process for that.
Yeah. And I want to get into a little bit of this phrase that I feel like maybe you're creating that I've never heard before. And so I'm going to attribute it to just like, this is your phrase. But I love it. You have this phrase of trauma-informed intelligence and TQ.
Oh yeah. 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 That's, I don't even know. It's just something that I'm playing around with, because sometimes I call it TQ, sometimes I call it trauma IQ. But it is really the driving force behind this manuscript that I'm writing, which is a memoir of my own illness, but more so a memoir about embodied history and historical trauma. And, anybody who's written a book or has the urge to write a book can probably identify with this, which is that sometimes I'm just like, why? Like, where does this pathology come from? I mean, why am I trying to do this?
Yeah.
And
that's how I feel even doing the podcast sometimes. I'm like,
right?
Why?
Any
what am I doing?
Sustained creative pursuit, it's kind of like, why?
Yes.
But I just keep coming back to this drive to want to talk about trauma in a way that, so that trauma doesn't have to be extra, it just is. Trauma just is, in the way that I kind of came around to my pain just is. And trauma happens, and we are not going to ever prevent trauma from happening. But what we can do more of is understand the distinctions between an event that is traumatic, or, conditions that are traumatic, and then trauma related response to those events, and how in the response to those events or conditions lies all of this opportunity to be able to organize our society towards better supporting people who go through trauma, to be able to not have these long-term lasting effects that can go on for generations. Yeah. And so basically, in order to deal with everything from the chronic diseases that can be traced back to trauma, like through the ACEs study is a whole other thing that could probably be its own podcast, but that's basically a study that showed and linked different types of childhood adversity to chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes and also mental health challenges. Yeah. And so being able to understand trauma better can help us prevent that type of the long-term effects of that type of childhood adversity, all the way to being able to interrupt cycles of intergenerational trauma and the way that trauma gets passed on. And so to me, understanding trauma better and increasing our IQ around trauma it's like a public health imperative. And Nancy Krieger, who's a public health a leader, talks about that a lot. And when you think about, actual epidemics of like infectious diseases, for example, like people will talk about how measles is coming back. We need to talk about that, right? And how, how malaria kills, way too many people in the developing world. But, we don't talk about trauma, even though it has such huge, widespread, and lasting effects. We don't talk about it in a way that feels as regular as talking about the flu and are you going to get your flu shot. Yeah. And so a lot of the reason that I'm writing this book is to be able to contribute to this growing conversation, because I do think it's a moment where it is becoming more common and in nuanced ways, right? Not just like, oh my God, I was so traumatized because because I didn't get my nails done today. But that, it's a real nuanced conversation about trauma as it affects our health.
Yeah. And, I'm, I guess in a way disappointed, but also maybe I don't fully know because I was still really young when this happened. But even like when 9/11 happened, that's, a whole nation in a state of trauma. And that I still don't recall that conversation was even had as to this being something that was traumatic for the entire nation. And I guess disappointed in a way that, we have these opportunities to discuss trauma and to discuss mental health on a, national, global level, even as you look at climate change and how that's going to be impacting.
That's right.
And already is impacting communities around the world, that is also a form of trauma now that individuals are having to figure out how to cope with, not only physically and like tangibly and logistically, but like emotionally. And I think that's where, unfortunately, we aren't really taught how to do those things. And sometimes we don't even know, in your instance, when you think about like potential birth trauma, that, you don't even think of that as a thing or aren't really even aware of that. And so how do you even learn to cope with that? It's all a conversation that very much needs to continue.
That's right. And I'm so glad that you brought up climate change, because I think that is a perfect example of the kind of system-wide issue, really literally universal issue that brings trauma to the forefront of what we are all going to be facing more and more over the next decades. And there's a whole approach to trauma-informed systems that we could be looking at how to apply to everything, right? Yeah. So there's trauma-informed schools and how, teachers and other people in the building can support students from a place of understanding that there's a lot going on, and instead of disciplining first, actually being able to take care of emotional needs first, and trauma-informed medical systems. And so then what does it look like to have, trauma-informed communities where part of the resilience to climate change is, an emotional resilience and sort of a sense of safety and all of the economic factors that need to contribute to that, right? And also talking about 9/11, I think that the difference between 2001, 2002, and today is huge in seeing how there is more of a knowledge of trauma, I think, since then, and more of a public discussion around it, because I agree that after that happened, there wasn't necessarily that type of discussion happening, except in pockets. But then you look today at a lot of the conversations around what's happened to migrant families and how children have been torn away from their parents because of ICE and Homeland Security and Trump's policies. And there's been actually a lot of conversation leading around the traumatic effects of that separation.
Even to this conversation too, another example of that I think would be all the mass shootings, actually. That's right. Both of those things. I think there has been, as I really think about it, there has been a little bit of an emphasis around how traumatic these things are. And so that is coming more to the forefront. And unfortunately, more people, I think, are experiencing trauma in ways that we couldn't have decades ago, just even through this knowledge that things like this happened, and being able to watch videos of these children and videos of these shootings and whatnot, that people are experiencing trauma just by watching, this video on this and being so connected to it, that, I think there definitely is more of a conversation around it today than perhaps back then.
Yeah, and I think I find that hopeful because, again, having more conversation around trauma and increasing trauma IQ,
TQ, You gotta keep it TQ. I like it.
You like the TQ?
Okay,
like so that's a vote for TQ.
Yes.
Let's see what your listeners think. TQ or trauma IQ, which is better? It's just not about, getting into being re-traumatized again. It's really about how do we look at the supports that we need to be able to heal, knowing that post-traumatic stress is a real thing.
Yeah. And I'm curious for you as we kind of wrap up here, what I know we've talked about therapy being an outlet in terms of coping with trauma, that, your body has responded in a way, there's been perhaps some more unhealthy ones like sexual addiction. But I'm curious what other ways you find today that you are able to cope with trauma.
Great question. Being in community with people that I can talk about it with is key. So that's probably another reason that I have this impulse to widen that community. Being able to have better sleep
sleep is very
really
important.
Key thing. And getting proper medication to be able to sleep better has really changed things for me. Also, staying actively engaged and in social justice circles is also something that is actually really healing for me, and that has been shown to help with countering isolation, and also honestly, just sometimes it gives a way to be able to feel like a lot of this pain that's trapped inside me, it has an outlet. I can channel it towards ways to change systems towards healing. And then, just daily practices, like making sure that we sit down and have like a good meal with me and my partner and my son. And I started to grow things like flowers that feels good. So
some plant therapy. There's some real science behind that. I don't know all of it, but it is, I think, becoming a growing thing now that people, as we have more hipsters, I guess, that people are becoming more and more connected to plants. And I mean, as we sit here in my apartment, I have a few around, and it really does.
I keep looking at that beautiful green plant right there.
Yeah, it makes such a difference, honestly, for me and my mental health. So I'm glad to hear that you're growing flowers.
Yes, that plant life. It can be really fun.
Yeah, it's very rewarding for me in many ways. Well, I would love, we mentioned a piece of your work at the beginning here that I'll definitely put in the episode notes, but if people want to find you or learn more about you or reach out to you or follow some of your work, where would be some of the places that people could check you out at?
Oh, I would love if people would want to connect to me on Instagram. It's Jen Soriano Writes is my handle. Yeah. And I enjoy direct messages on there and just being in conversation about all of this.
Yeah, so everyone just slide into Jen's DM, basically. Thank you so much for your vulnerability and for sharing all of everything that you did today. I think for me, it's been super helpful, and I've learned a lot of things I didn't know in general, but also about you, and that's so personal. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure. All right, that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for making it all the way through and keeping your ears, your hearts, and your minds open. It would mean so much to me if you could take a second or two after listening to this episode to leave a review on iTunes and let me know what you're enjoying about the show. I love reading, what your favorite episodes are, where you guys listen, and definitely feel free to share this with a friend. Part of how we break down the stigmas around these topics is by talking about them, right? And sharing them with more people. So definitely share the podcast. And again, really wanting to include all of you in this podcast. So if you have questions or you want to share a thought or an experience, please send in a voice memo to ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. And I'm really excited to keep having these conversations and breaking down these stigmas. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next time.